Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagano, and we are back here in Studio 130 for another episode of Iowa's premier conservative podcast. I've got John Hendrickson with me. It's just the two of us today, and we're going to roll through a whole bunch of things, but we're excited to be here. John, how are you today?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Outstanding. We've got a lot to cover. We've got the legislative session right around the corner. Starting Monday, and then obviously the Iowa Caucuses, depending on what you really follow. I don't know which one we're more excited about, but the beginning of session is always fun. So I want to cover that. Obviously, what's on the hearts and minds of many Iowans is what happened in Perry yesterday. We had a student that took a shotgun to school, and I think everyone's followed that story, and I don't know that obviously everyone's thinking about that, and it's a tragedy, and the weighs on everyone's hearts. Came home last night, and the kids all wanted to, ask questions about that and everything, but I saw something this morning. I don't need to give a really insightful take on what happened or what needs to happen, but the principal, Dan Marburger, was one of the victims, although is apparently in stable condition now in the hospital. But there was an article about this morning that apparently he spent some amount of time trying to talk the shooter down, and that he put himself in harm's way and tried to talk to the shooter, and that the idea being that bought a lot of extra time for the rest of the students to get out of the building. And there was a long Facebook post that was linked in this article in the Des Moines Register by one of his the principal's children. I think maybe an adult child. Yeah, it was. Just about that's kind of who he was. And he cared about all his students, and he was, but my point being is that, obviously the tragedy that happened is the focus, but I just take a minute to recognize that in that was an act of heroism, and that you have an individual who's presumably dedicated his life to these kids in this school. And when that horrible thing came to pass, he ran to the danger.
Yeah.
And was right. And I don't know the exact circumstances, but he presumably saved the lives of some of his students. And we hope that he's going to have a full recovery. I have no idea what the extent of his injuries are from being shot, but we have real heroes in Iowa and real heroes across the country. But I think we should absolutely call that for what it is and be thankful that we have people like this that are committed to the lives of Iowa's children. So anyway, I had to make that point because those kinds of things I don't think are pointed out long enough. And if you are one of the ones that want to make this political right out of the gate, I don't have any time for that. We see reporters that want to make it about the presidential caucuses and trying to find the intersection between all of that. And I don't have any time for that. Deal with the situation. But yeah, a little ray of sunshine in that, as limited as it might be. So, anyway, before we move on, as promised, John, I want to talk about the caucuses coming up. And maybe we'll have time to do a little bit more of a show on this next week, but I don't want to put you on the spot, but in your mind, has the state of play really changed in the last few weeks, couple months, or is everything kind of where it has been?
I think it's the status quo remains, and I don't have any inside knowledge. That's just my assumption, but I still think the big thing is turnout.
Yeah,
and you see all the candidates doing events, doing a man dash to the finish line here, and trying to get their people to turn out on the 15th for caucus. So, I don't know how much has changed. I will say I think Nikki Haley's momentum is starting to fizzle out, at least in Iowa.
Yeah.
And one reason I think that is one of her statements this week, which I thought just smacked of elitism in the stuff that
this people, was it. She made these comments in New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And basically, she told a group in New Hampshire that they would have to correct the mistake of Iowa. And I'm not quoting her exactly, but she did use
that
the
word.
word
I know she
correct.
used that word.
Yeah, and so that basically that whatever Iowa does, New Hampshire will have to correct us. And I, and I know Iowa and New Hampshire have supported different Republicans in the past, but I mean for her to say that I thought was just, again, to me it reminded me of just some of these elite politicians that just don't really care for grassroots.
Yeah, I don't know if did she make any clarifying comments on that later on.
I'm not sure.
Sometimes it can be a poor choice of words, and I'm not necessarily trying to spin that in any way. There is this. Oh, I know the folks in New Hampshire really think this idea that Iowa sort of winnows the field. There's 3 tickets out of Iowa, and then New Hampshire puts a little different spin on that, and they usually take some pride in picking someone different, and then that sort of frames the race from there on. But I don't know if correcting what Iowa did. I mean, that's sort of, in my mind, if that is what she meant to say, that sort of leads me to think that it's a criticism of the kinds of candidates that win Iowa.
Yeah,
and it's historically been a more conservative, specifically socially conservative candidate.
Yeah.
And sort of the conventional wisdom or the stereotype is that New Hampshire wants a little bit more of a fiscally minded, libertarian, or more moderate candidate.
I think that's right.
So, maybe she's playing to the crowd in New Hampshire. It's possible. I don't know. But I think I've seen in my, social media, a lot of folks, and I've heard this from some folks, just one-on-one, that those comments don't resonate real well among Iowans.
No.
So, but
it's just I was surprised she said something like that, because even if I know if the polls are right, her and DeSantis are fighting for who comes out second in Iowa, but it's not a good thing to say.
Let me give you what I think might be going on there. Is she may think I'm probably not going to rise any higher than third in Iowa, even though I continue to get 2 to 3 mailers a day in my mailbox from.
Yes,
but she has an opportunity potentially to win New Hampshire altogether, and maybe she is playing to that. Like I'll take maybe my third place in Iowa if it's better grade, and if I win New Hampshire, then I move on to South Carolina where I actually have a real opportunity to compete. I don't think she can beat Donald Trump in South Carolina, but that's where it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see that maybe a comment like that is tactical to that end, although I still think there's probably a little bit more artful way to make that point. Yeah. But, I noticed that, and I've heard people talking about that together. I agree with you, John, that I don't think that the state of play has changed a lot. And I expected it would. I mean, if history is a guide, there's usually something that sort of shakes things up a little bit towards the end. But I think the biggest thing that I see is the battle for second place. Is that Governor DeSantis and Ambassador Haley are going toe-to-toe, throwing everything at each other to see who can rise above. Meanwhile, you have Donald Trump over here in a lane all on his own, who's running a purely positive message based on his record. And, you see building the wall back up again and all that. He's just running the normal positive campaign. And, boy, that sure adds up to me to almost Donald Trump getting a free pass to a win in Iowa.
Yeah.
And, well, anyway.
I would agree, and I think 2 things on that point. One is I was listening to Larry Kudlow's program on Fox Business, and he was talking about how one thing about former President Trump is he's run a very specific campaign on issues, and he's also responding to President Biden. And I think that's appealing to voters. The other point I want to make about that is something that I know we've talked about before on this program, is something that the former speaker, Newt Gingrich, had said about, Trump is more than just a candidate. He's a leader of a movement. Yeah. And I think those are 2 important things to keep in mind.
Yeah. So briefly before we move on beyond the caucus, I think you're right. I think it comes down to turnout, which is organizational strength, and the caucuses are largely in that, and enthusiasm.
Yes. Yeah.
And so organizational strength, I don't know that there's any. The different campaigns will try and say there's a metric that shows we've got this many precinct chairs or this many committed caucus goers. You know, I've seen the DeSantis campaign throw out some big numbers on that. They've got precinct chairs everywhere. They've got all these commits. And if they can generate those numbers, they will do very well on caucus night. My perspective is that I don't think that Nikki Haley has built out that organization at that same level in terms of just number of people on the ground, the precinct chairs and all of that. I'm not saying that that's predictive, but and again, the Trump campaign is playing a little bit different game here. And I don't know that they've ever done it quite by the same model, or maybe try and trumpet their numbers as much. So I don't have as keen of an understanding of how built out that campaign is in terms of grassroots door to door. But I'm sure I know they do have a strong campaign. I just don't know with this fine a detail how it's going. Yeah. But anyway, but the other piece too is enthusiasm. And if there is this idea that, well, Donald Trump's going to win the caucuses, does that mean that his supporters are less likely to show up? Or does it mean that, you know, DeSantis, Haley supported, like, well, we're not going to win, so I'm going to sit this out? I don't have an answer to that. I think over the last 8 years, Trump supporters have proven to be very passionate about Donald Trump. And then beyond that, it's just, just the continued energy behind those campaigns. I really don't know who has captured the most enthusiasm from their candidate.
I think you summed that up really, really good, and I think those are great questions to think about. And one thing I think you're right is just seeing the schedules of all the campaigns. I mean, even the Trump campaign are doing multiple events.
Yes.
And so nobody's taking this for granted of saying this is a locked-in. No one's basically saying I've got this in the bag, and
right.
And so I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I talked yesterday with some of my friends on the Trump campaign, and I think they're optimistic, but they are absolutely not taking it for granted, and they want a big win.
Yes.
So they're not taking that for granted. Yeah, that's right. It kind of come back to yard signs don't vote, but I am seeing a lot more DeSantis yard signs popping up. But I still think the candidate that has a lot of people with homemade yard signs is probably an indicator of some enthusiasm, and that's definitely still President Trump. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Yes.
If you are one of our listeners, and make sure you go and participate. If you've never been to a caucus before, it is not like how the Democrats run theirs. And and I know that much is said in the media about how the caucuses function. The Republican caucuses are far easier to participate in. They're far more accessible. Yeah, it's going to be a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour of your time. If it's a big location, maybe a little longer, but you get to hear the speeches and talk to the people. But it's not this fiasco where you're stuck in a school gym for hours on end. It's not that, right, John?
That's right.
Okay, good. Yeah. And it's your neighbors. At the end of the day, it's the folks in your neighborhood that you're interacting with. It's not just some mass of people at a rally somewhere. And I kind of get a kick out of that part too.
Yes, it's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. So good. Well, the other big news is the Iowa General Assembly gavels into session this coming Monday. So we've got a lot to do. We spent a lot of time on the last episode talking about income taxes. And so I don't want to spend really a ton of time on that again. I want to just go through some of the issues that ITR and our family organizations are working on this year, and then just see what else is coming up. So, apart from the whole greatest state level income tax cuts in U.S. history. So just forget that part, John. Some of the other things that we want to work on is, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this, writing about this, but these constitutional amendments that kind of come around side of to protect and secure things. So talk about that a little bit. And I know that Senator Dawson had a couple of those ideas last year. I want to spend a little time on those.
Yeah, there has been a push in recent legislative sessions, and as you said, just last session, Senator Dawson introduced a bill that contained 2 constitutional protections for taxpayers. The first would require a 2/3 majority of both houses of the legislature to increase the income tax, which has been introduced before in past sessions, but it has never really moved. And it's, I think, about 16 states have a 2/3 majority requirement for tax increases. And I know Senator Dawson has said in different times that, there's a lot of different spending protections in the state constitutions, but nothing for the taxpayer. And this would actually be a very strong protection for taxpayers to make sure that, it's not easy for a future legislature to raise taxes, and it forces them to justify their spending. Mm-hmm. So that's one of them. The other one is I think just as important. That has to deal with the Taxpayer Relief Fund, and basically what Senator Dawson proposed was constitutionally protecting that fund so it only can be used for income and sales tax relief. And basically, there had been efforts before to try to maybe use that fund for local government aid or property tax relief or even for education. And it's as we know, it's a huge amount of money right now, over $3 billion. And so what I think they should do is honor the original intent. And of course, you were part of when that was created. But honoring the original intent of that and making sure that it is used for income tax relief, that it goes back to the taxpayer. And so those are just two constitutional amendments that could resurface in this session. Another one that could possibly come up, which I think would be a good idea, is Iowa has a 99% spending limitation. And putting that into the Constitution or strengthening that would be a good idea. So that would be a third one that may come up.
Yeah, you hear a lot made of the 99% expenditure limitation, and it is an exceptionally weak limitation for a number of reasons. One is that it is only in the Iowa Code; it's not in the Constitution. And so, since the legislature writes the laws, that they can use the magic word, which is notwithstanding. The legislature can pretty much ignore other parts of the Iowa Code by writing another piece of the Iowa Code. So if they want to deviate from that, they certainly can. And it has been done from time to time, more before sort of the Republican ascendancy in 2010. I think there's one year we had to go above that very briefly. But anyway, and the other thing, too, is it's on available revenue, not ongoing revenue.
Yes, yeah.
And that's a very different. So if you have a year where you have some surplus dollars, you could spend more than what the state collects in revenue. And that's sort of tapping into one-time money for ongoing expenses, and that's a bad idea. And so at a minimum, simply changing that to an ongoing revenue number, although, and we've talked about this before, John, the legislature is spending, it's in the mid-80s now?
Yes, about 88% or less than 80,
of ongoing revenue is being spent. And that's why we continue to generate these surplus amounts and the amount that's going into the Taxpayer Relief Fund. So right now, it's really not even an issue because the legislature has the fiscal restraint on its own that this doesn't come into play. However, it's not always going to be like this.
That's right.
And that's the other thing, too, on the supermajority to raise taxes. Right now, I don't even think it'd be an issue at all because the current regime at the Capitol has no interest in raising taxes. They interest in cutting taxes. But that may not always be the case. And there's a little bit here that, beyond just, it takes more votes. And so it makes it harder to raise taxes. Great. But what it also does, we don't have very many things that require a supermajority in Iowa. The main one is the Senate needs it to confirm for boards and commissions. But what it does, unless one party has a 2/3 majority, which is really rare, the Senate does right now, is it does give a little bit of leverage to the minority party. Because if, for example, you had the chamber flip, let's say the House flips, and Democrats are in control, they can't get to 2/3 without Republican votes. And so it may go over and okay, well, we're in really dire straits, and maybe we'll give you this very limited increase in exchange for our votes, but you're going to do some real spending reductions too. And so you
Yeah.
get that little bit of leverage that comes with it.
That's
Of
a great point.
Of needing to get to
Yeah.
a supermajority. So it's more than just needing more votes.
Mhm.
And I think it's a good thing. I think there's probably many other things that we could look at needing a supermajority for.
Yeah.
But, you got to be really careful with
Yeah.
that as well.
And just one more point on that quick before we move on, but I think one example to look at for Iowans to consider why spending amendments are important is Colorado right now.
Mhm.
Colorado probably has the most, probably the strongest state spending limitation in the country, and that's called TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And the Colorado governor and the Democratic legislature have been trying all kinds of tricks to try to undermine TABOR. And TABOR has returned billions of dollars back to taxpayers, and they're trying everything they do to try to ratchet up spending, and they're trying to weaken TABOR. But TABOR, thankfully, is still holding and making sure that taxpayers not only get to keep more of their money, but then it also keeps government spending in check. So it's been a good protection.
Yep, good. One other issue that we have in the ITR issue guide is just ongoing fiscal discipline and conservative budgeting.
Yes.
And I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on it
No.
because it's pretty self-explanatory. And actually, now that I pull it out, our chart has since I flipped the page, we're down in the low 80s now on spending percentage.
Yeah.
And we need to continue that.
Yeah.
If it will help us it will ensure that the tax cuts we've already passed work and give us the opportunity to do more in the future, which it looks like we're going to do. And I heard this line that's used periodically. It's making sure that Iowans are getting their money's worth out of their contribution to government. And that's the hard work of setting priorities in the budget, separating wants from needs. And when something isn't as necessary as something else, you make the difficult decision to say, we're not going to fund that this year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this legislature has continued to show tremendous leadership on the budget. So there's some other things that we want to work on with regard to regulatory reform. So we have a concept of regulatory sandboxes, which is a limited relief in order to try and start new industries. There is certificate of need in healthcare that we might be working on. The whole idea being that an oppressive or unnecessarily burdensome regulatory regime is kind of a hidden tax.
It is, yeah.
It stifles innovation, it stifles growth, and it's just less freedom for Iowans. So I don't know what else you want to add on the whole idea of regulatory reform.
Yeah. Regulatory reform is important because, as you said, it is a hidden tax. And I remember having a debate with a political science professor on this point, and he said, John, regulations are just rules on a paper, but and that's true, but they also have a cost to them, and it costs businesses. And if you have a lot of regulation, it not only hinders businesses and their ability to grow, but it also, regulations also hurt individuals. So, for example, a few sessions ago, maybe 2 years ago, I can't remember, they did, legislature passed the beginnings of what we call occupational licensing reform, where you make it easier for people to earn a living. And you mentioned regulatory sandbox, where you want to try to make sure that regulations are fair and consistent and not overly burdensome, that you encourage entrepreneurship, and with regulatory sandbox, it just allows people that have an idea to develop that idea safely. And it doesn't mean that public safety or things like that are set aside, but it's the governor started a good process of reviewing state regulations, and there's been a lot of research that showed that Iowa, especially in our region, has been one of the more regulated states, and so I think it's good to begin that and have more oversight on regulation.
Yeah, I think it's important too you talked about this idea that they're just rules.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're still policy, all of them, even if they're very minor and very innocuous. Those are all policy decisions. And the dangerous thing, I think, with rules that are promulgated is that those are not made by elected officials.
Mm-hmm.
Those are policy decisions that have been delegated to the state bureaucracy and other officials.
Yes. Yeah.
And sometimes that's perfectly appropriate. In fact, maybe in many times it's appropriate. I don't know that I want the Iowa General Assembly writing our banking regulations. Let's have some folks work with the regulators. So it's fine. Okay, I don't want to get in too much into that. However, this idea that none of them are political decisions. I had a law professor once in a group I was a part of that had studied rules and regulations that made the case that, since lawmakers are political and there could be lobbyists getting in the way of that, we should give these decisions to the ideologically pure folks that are in the state bureaucracy, which is just laughable, right?
Yeah.
Because the flip side and what he's not telling you is that elected official still has to go to the voters.
Yes.
So you step too far out of bounds, they got to be responsible to that as well. And so I think, and in Iowa, I think there are areas where we probably need to dial back the regulations, but I think we do a pretty good job with our oversight of rules and regulations, but we can always improve on that. But I think you see this, it's just out of control at the federal level.
Yeah.
The amount of places where Congress has just simply abdicated their authority and given the entire subject matter over to the administrative state with no oversight other than the executive branch, which largely doesn't want to do anything with it. And things just go on, and the American people are left with little to no recourse over that, over trying to lift a bill out of Congress or replacing the president, which those are difficult. And anyway, my point being is that, we should have regulatory reform, and we should also encourage the legislature to not always just give it all up to rulemaking, because that can be fraught with peril. If there are legitimate policy decisions that need to be made within a subject matter, the legislature should try and tackle them. So
that's right. And you mentioned certificate of need, which is a very complex issue, but dealing with healthcare and basically, in a sense, certificate of need laws provide a monopoly to existing providers, which, and especially in rural areas, it limits access to healthcare. And so we've seen other states like West Virginia and South Carolina repeal or partially repeal their certificate of need laws, which and then open the doors for more access to healthcare and actually reduce costs to healthcare. And so certificate of need laws are just another thing that's they're sort of obsolete, I think. And COVID kind of taught us that as well. Yeah.
We're not a healthcare policy organization here, but we are in favor of the places where the rules, regulations, and laws are anti-competitive and allowing free market decisions to govern these. And that's what gives rise to our support for certificate of need, is allowing the free market to make these decisions. And we believe actually improve not only healthcare costs, but healthcare options across the state of Iowa. So, yeah. What else are you looking at for the session coming up?
Well, I think I don't know if it's going to come up, but I know an issue that we keep on working on is property tax, and we have in there in the guide our support of spending or budget limit on a local level, and I think that would be a good idea to explore. And I think we don't delve into social issues, but I know the legislature will be dealing more with probably some social issues, and because that's just a reality. I mean, this whole fight against the woke agenda is going to continue, and as it should.
I was talking with a member of the House Republican Caucus last night, who I'm close with, who said, absolutely, we're looking for ways that we can continue to push back on this. Some of it's simply because of losses in the courts, but the left isn't stopping on those issues. I don't know why we would expect conservatives to stop on those issues. I think on the property tax thing, John, it's important that we point out, we believe the fundamental, one is local government engagement. I can't forget that. The real solution is getting Iowans involved at the local level and letting them make those decisions at the local level. But it has to be spending restraint.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether it's done voluntarily at the local level because they're listening to their citizens, or it's done at the Capitol because the locals won't do it on their own.
Yeah.
But that is the solution. It's not about monkeying around with this, that, and the next thing. They might help, and I don't want to discount those ideas, but restraining spending has to be, because look, that's what's enabled this at the state level.
Absolutely.
You restrained spending, you were able to reduce the tax burden. it absolutely has to be that way at the local level as well. Restrain spending, reduce taxes.
Yeah. And to build on that, I'm excited to see what the governor will put forward in the legislature in terms of continuing the state government reform initiative. And I'm hoping they will adopt the boards and commissions review to eliminate some of that. And that's what it is. That you are absolutely right. The state has shown the example of how to manage something fiscally sound, and that's exactly what they're doing. And and this is not a good example, but I remember I served on the library board, and I mean it's a small budget,
right?
But that's what we did. And when we had a new director came in, and I have to say our director was not a conservative; he was a liberal. But the director, and I remember because I was chair of the finance committee, he went through that whole budget and found all kinds of waste. And it added up. And that's just a very small example, but that's what local governments need to be doing. And that's what Governor Reynolds and the legislature have been doing is making sure government is efficient and accountable to the taxpayer.
Yep.
And that's where you can make these good tax reform decisions. And it all starts with that sound budgeting.
Yep. I think that's very well said. And I think that's probably a good place for us to try and land the airplane here. But there's a lot happening. I think there's a lot of things that we're going to be speaking on, writing about, supporting the legislature, maybe tapping the brakes a little bit of trying to get that. And so, for those folks out there that listen to our podcast and maybe don't get the rest of what we put out, I mean, make sure you're following ITR and ITR Foundation on social media. Make sure that you're signed up for the ITR Watchdog newsletter that comes out during session. We try and do that once a week. I know the foundation, which has a lot of your content in it, John, that comes out periodically during session.
I think the first Watchdog.
Yes, I believe that's right. It is. It's really good. I know because you helped work on it. That's why it's good, John. But yeah, no, we'll have that out, and you can stay up to date on what's happening in more real time during the session. But we're going to be here back on the podcast talking about it and trying to keep you all up to speed on what we see happening and what's around the corner. So appreciate everything. Thank you, John. All right, listeners, don't forget to share this with your friends, and so we can get as many people on here listening to what John has to say. People need to hear from John. I'm not as convinced they need to hear from me, but we want to make sure everybody out there is tuned in. So with that all having been said, thank you for joining us. We will see you next time on ITR Live.